guys, this is Jenna Burt, host of the Confessions of a Military Spouse podcast. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hey guys, and welcome to Beauties and Headcanons, where we're nerdy, and you probably are too. My name is Elizabeth, and I have a special guest host here today to discuss horror movies and the horror movie genre and its history. As we're drawing towards Halloween, I kind of wanted to do something a little different than what we've been doing the past couple of Halloweens, and so I wanted to kind of tackle horror movies as a whole genre, because we haven't really touched that much on them in general, really just kind of mentions here and there, and I kind of wanted to just dig into it a little bit because it's one of my little favorite genres, and it's one of my guest hosts' favorite genres as well. So help me in welcoming Brian to our show.
Hey! I'm across the internet.
Yes!
How's it going?
Yeah, so I know you run a podcast of your own.
I do. I am the show producer and one of the co-hosts of the Cinema Psycho show. We are a horror, not necessarily horror, we're a movie review podcast. We basically talk about everything movies. We have filmmaker interviews every once in a while. We get a lot of indie films that we review. That's kind of our new thing. And we've been going hard on the podcast scene for over 150 episodes now.
Wow.
So we just dropped 151 episodes last, I think it was Friday. So yeah, we've been going strong for a little over 3 years.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I run that podcast. I'm also an independent filmmaker myself. I am also an adjunct professor, so I've got the professor hat as well. Not in horror, unfortunately. I'm fighting for that class, if I can get that, you know. But yeah, I teach visual effects and animation at a university in Pittsburgh, and I make my own horror movies, so I kind of am a jack of all trades.
That's awesome. We're getting close to that 150 ourselves. We're at 115 right now, so we're chugging along there. Just chugging.
It's fun. Because we did a live stream for 150th episode. We talked about the Psycho franchise, which is fun because Psycho should not be a franchise, yet it is. So it was a lot of, well, let's just talk about Psycho for about the first 2/3 of the episode, and then we'll just mention those sequels that happen to have been made.
Yeah, we don't. It's kind of like the live action Avatar movie. We don't mention it. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about that.
Yeah, we don't need to.
We don't need to talk about M. Night Shyamalan and all of his movies.
Yeah.
Ever again.
Yeah. So I wanted to just kind of since we haven't really covered horror movies in general, I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a history, because I was looking at a whole listing of horror movies and when they came out, and especially with some of them, I found it really interesting that they corresponded with certain periods of time, and their themes kind of lined up with different things going on at the time, which obviously makes sense.
Yeah.
But looking at it with that perspective, you realize that it really comes with a different layer of context that we, in this time period, are missing completely.
Well, I would I would argue against that. I'm a firm believer that horror, for the most part, excuse me, I am dealing with a cold, so I'm going to clear my throat a bit when I go on a diatribe. So I am of the mind that horror always is, it's either an escape from the real horrors of reality, or it is a reflection of our reality. So I believe that every time period has their either social struggle or their big issue, and it our horror movies kind of are reflections of that or escapes from it. If you look at, say, the Universal monster movies that came out in the 30s, going up all the way through World War II, those were escapist films. They were mainly designed at the same time as the America was coming out of the Great Depression. The movies were relatively inexpensive entertainment, so you would go watch Dracula or Frankenstein, after you had been in the bread lines for maybe that day. So I mean, that's an escapist type of horror movie. But you look at, say, the movies of Jordan Peele nowadays, like Us and what's the other one he did?
Get Out.
Get Out. Those are more reflections of our current society and how, especially, we deal with race. So I mean, that's they're two different paths with it.
Oh no, I definitely agree. And I mean, obviously, horror as a genre has many different branches to it. There's so many like subgenres under it, so many things that can be considered horror, and so I mean, you're going to get like a huge variety as to what is considered horror, especially at any given time. And so I like I said, I found it interesting to look at even how different societal things affected it. Especially like during the Cold War, it seemed like there was just this big expansion of this whole, idea of like nuclear arms or, nuclear, energy kind of somehow going wrong.
Yeah.
And, I'm looking at it, I'm like, as a big Fallout fan, I'm looking at it and like, this kind of almost seems familiar. And I kind of could see where they maybe drew some inspiration from some of them.
I mean, definitely. I mean, you look at the 50s and 60s especially, and I'm talking mainly in America. I'm not talking about England. England in that same time period was not nearly as obsessed with the atomic, nuclear winter. That was an American thing. That was not that. And in fact, what at the time, it's kind of interesting. At the exact same time that the whole nuclear scare was happening, and we got giant spiders and giant monsters and things like that, you had in England the Hammer films and Amicus films that were being made that were the rebirth of Gothic horror, but now adding sex and blood and color with it. So it's interesting to kind of see that just between those two areas you get that. But getting back to the American Cold War, like phobias, that I think is hand in hand with our kind of primal fear and appreciation for it. It's kind of goes both ways of technology. When you realize that mankind has the ability to split the atom, that was a relatively new concept. That our technology, which began with just stones, in the Stone Age and moved all the way up to metallurgy and things like that. That our technology, our grasp, got to the point where we could do, in essence, what most people thought was impossible. And it's like, well, what do you do with that power? How can that power go wrong? And that's where you get, the kind of atomic nuclear winter monster things of the 50s and 60s. It's a really interesting, kind of look into that time period. Oh, yeah,
definitely. And I feel like, I'm sorry to keep going off on the gaming thing, but I feel
that's cool. That's cool.
I feel like Fallout really played into a lot of that, especially with the forced evolutionary virus that caused super mutants and all the other, nuclear effects they had with the ghouls and the glowing ones and all the mutated animals, and some of which are fine and docile and some of which are monstrous and will just attack you on sight. Death claws and gator claws and just all kinds of mutated animals that it's interesting to kind of see what, at least in an alternate universe, what a result like that could be,
Yeah. I mean, I'll be the first to say, since having children, I don't have time for gaming at all. So as I mentioned, all the hats that I wear,
yes,
I really, so you're going off on that. I'm like, I don't know any of that. But it absolutely is right. I mean, you even look at Night of the Living Dead, build, made in Pittsburgh. Got to mention that.
Oh yes.
1968. That was again tying in with, the military-industrial complex at the time, Vietnam War you can pull from it, and also, again, just, kind of paranoia of the government at the time. This was right around the civil rights movement happening. This was, a lot of things were happening in which, you're kind of looking at the government in maybe they did kind of dump chemical weapons or something like that on, Evans City and cause zombies to pop up. So I mean, there's definitely parallels that you can pull from the different kind of socio-political crises of the time.
Oh yeah, and I mean, mentioning the 60s and 70s, I feel that's especially in the American venue that seems to be where horror movies kind of just completely took off. At least as far as the movies that I really love to watch and kind of look back on as some of my favorites, that's when they started coming out. And, I think it's part of this whole, the Vietnam War just kind of, desensitizing people in a way and kind of needing, on one hand, an escape and on one hand, a kind of way to view these crises and these things that are going on through a different lens, to kind of process them in a different way.
Definitely. I mean, that's, and you also got to look at the, what type of horrors did those people see, and it's okay, yeah, I saw, my friend, a fellow soldier get blown up by an enemy, and, or I saw this village get tortured. I mean, you look at the different torture things that even our country did, to those people. And it's I don't think Dracula in a cape is going to cut it. After that, so that's where you do get in the 70s. Sometimes some of the almost grindhouse exploitative ultra violence type of horror, because I think it's an answer to that. The other thing too is with the 70s, that's also the birth of the slasher genre, where it's where the horror isn't in a castle anymore. It is down the street. Yes.
One of my absolute favorites was Halloween, because one of my favorite things about Michael Myers was that he never spoke. And to me, that is just absolutely terrifying, to have this huge person or entity coming after you and they don't speak. You can't talk with them. You can't reason with them. You can only hope to run and hide and outlast. And it speaks to some deep primal thing in you, because, you would want to try to talk to somebody, to try to relate to them on some level. You might try that with somebody like Dracula, who, at least in classic literature, is very well spoken and, very, very talkative, at least. And, you don't get that with somebody like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees.
I am not, in my kind of pantheon of horror icons, I'll be the first to say, and this might be considered sacrilege, and I am not that big of a fan of Halloween or Jason, and it's actually because of the fact that they don't speak. I actually I'm more in line with the serial killers Freddy Krueger, Pinhead from the Hellraiser series, even Chucky to some degree. I like personality. I like to see, even if it's kind of over the top. And I mean, Freddy Krueger, in the first Nightmare on Elm Street was not over the top at all. It was only in subsequent sequels that he got crazy and zany, and almost like a cartoon character. But, even in the first Nightmare, Freddy seemed like he was having fun. And I think that is far more terrifying, is if you can't reason with this person because they are getting enjoyment out of what they're doing.
And seeing it speaks to, I think, different things.
Yeah, absolutely, it does.
Whether, it's just this cold entity or this entity that is just enjoying what it's doing. It's, both terrifying. Obviously, different people will, interpret that in different ways. Some, you might not like the cold entity. I might find that subsequently more terrifying. Just speaks to the variety that, you can have even in a subgenre of horror.
And honestly, I think that is why there is, some appreciation. I don't have much appreciation for him, but Rob Zombie's horror movies, a lot of them are, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But a lot of them have that kind of personality with it. I call it white trash aesthetic personally. But I can see where people like it. I can see what people find enjoyment from, because it's the same thing as with Freddy Krueger or Pinhead. They're personalities.
Yeah.
And if you get behind the personalities, you'll get behind the story.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you were the one who introduced me to Hellraiser via the Hellbound Heart novella, and subsequently got me the movies as well.
Yep.
And that it still is honestly like one of my absolute favorite horror movies ever. I mean, I'll still go back and watch it. I mean, even I know I touched a little bit on the effects in our special effects episode, but I mean, even with the effects as it was, I mean, it's fantastic storytelling. It's
that's Clive Barker. That's
Clive
Barker for you.
Yeah, I mean, that overrides anything that might be considered dated in a movie, I think. And I think that's ultimately what can make something a classic, is even if there are, say, a few dated references, some dated visuals, effects, whatever, what have you, if you can still come back to it and find something in it that still speaks to you the same way as it did when you very first saw it, I think that's just something special that you don't really get out of a whole lot of movies these days.
No, and I mean, with Hellraiser especially, and I always go back to it because it is one of my favorites. There is something to be said for charm. Like, I really believe that. And a lot of people go back to these movies that came out at that time that, that was the highlight of the practical effects era. That was when you had Dick Smith. That's when you had Stan Winston. That's when you had, Image Entertainment was doing the effects for Hellraiser. So, I mean, you had practical, hands-on artistry, that you could interact with. It's almost like sculpture, and that's what they were doing, was they were creating sculptures that were living, and there is something to be said for that. In one of my classes, I actually had my students watch 2 clips of a video, because it's the class is a advanced visual effects course, so it's trying to talk about the practical side of it, and then also talking about the digital side of it, because I personally love both of them. I can see that we're both kind of have their merits. But I had them watch 2 clips. One was of the blood scene from the first Thing, the original Thing, and then it's from the prequel, in which, in essence, the same thing is happening, only it's, everybody's turning into monsters, but it's a CGI mess. And, you're looking at 2 movies that are separated by about 20 to 25 years. And you have to ask yourself, and I ask my students this, which one is more effective on you? And, every one of them said it was the original. Now, the original has blood. It has not nearly as artful of a CGI transformation or just as a transformation in general, as the CGI one does. The CGI one is more smooth, but that forces you to get creative. It forces you to get creative with lighting. It forces you to get creative with your cinematography. It forces you to get creative with just your editing. So all of those things are obstacles that force the filmmaker to be more creative and more resilient, in my opinion. I think it's easy for filmmakers nowadays to just say, well, you know what, we'll shoot them against a green screen and throw in the monster later. But is that going to translate into a better movie? Probably not.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. We're definitely talking, discussing, the minutia of the special effects makeup and effects and CGI. And, I think we pretty much all agree that, it's, at least these days, it's an appropriate marriage between the two, where you have the practical effects and the makeup, but then you have CGI just as kind of a backup to kind of maybe smooth it over a little bit, but it's in the background. It's not everything, Right. And I mean, it definitely has its place. You can do a lot, you can be a lot more flexible in some ways, but, you still, I think, have to be careful to not lose, I think, the charm and the practicality and just the translation that, you can get with something practical that you just completely lose in CGI.
Yeah. I mean, I this isn't a horror movie, but I mean, I saw what was it? I saw one of the new Star Wars films.
Yes.
The sequel trilogy, and they got to Supreme Leader Snoke, and I was sitting in the theater. I'm just like, tell me again why this couldn't have been a person in a mask or prosthetics. Why could it not be Andy Serkis in prosthetics? What was so crazy that you had to make it a CGI character? Because there is something to be said for, Emperor Palpatine in his prosthetics and actually, delivering those lines. That's why he's terrifying.
Yeah.
Because of the eyes, because of the prosthetics on his face. Like, all of that there is practical, So why did you have to do this very expensive CGI model of Andy Serkis performing? Like, it just made no sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, because you can get this sense that there is a living being underneath makeup, and you don't get that with CGI. So, I mean, whether it's Star Wars or whether it's a horror movie, I mean, I think it's, kind of the same deal where, the replacement of a digital thing with a real thing just makes it just another layer of terrifying in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
I did want to touch at least very briefly on the whole 90s and the interesting mix we get in there, because I swear 90s culture is just a mixed bag of everything. Like, no matter what you turn to, whether it's horror movies, whether it's movies in general, whether it's fashion, music, whatever, you get this huge mixed bag, and like, some of it could be good, some of it might be not so good. It's just kind of like you kind of close your eyes and kind of hope for the best.
Yeah, so the 90s are a weird decade. It really is. It's a weird decade. Because what are you beginning the 90s with in terms of horror? You're beginning it with the last gasp of the, slasher genre. With movies like Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, Leprechaun. You've got a couple Hellraiser movies in there, too. Well, actually, the Hellraiser movies continued, but they really started to go downhill.
Yeah, way downhill.
Through that. We don't need to talk about those.
Yeah, we really don't.
You can watch up to half of Bloodline. So that's the fourth one. Half of Bloodline, and then you can just kind of tune out forever. But, the 90s pretty much, they started off with what I thought, like, I didn't have a problem with those entries into the slasher genre. I actually have a soft spot for Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, because it was the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie that I remember being marketed to. I remember seeing the trailers for it. I remember, saying, oh, man, I want to see this. And same with Leprechaun. It's a goofy movie, but it's fun, And then you get to like 1995 and 94, where 94 especially, you get New Nightmare, which Wes Craven had said this at the time. He unfortunately passed away. That New Nightmare was a proto version of Scream. Like, it was literally, I'm going to experiment with this idea of going meta with my character Freddy Krueger. So 94 comes around, you've got that. Some people love it, some people hate it. I personally love it. And then 95, you get a movie like Tales from the Hood, which, really terrifying stuff. But there's little bits in there, here and there, that are good. Necronomicon's another great horror movie. A lot of H.P. Lovecraft adaptations came out of that. But then, around 95, 96, you get this, what I consider one of the lowest points in horror, and that, unfortunately, is Scream.
Yeah.
I am not a fan of Scream, or I Know What You Did Last Summer, or any of the subsequent movies of the latter half, because I've always viewed it as that's the point when you end up laughing at yourself. Like, when a genre starts laughing at itself, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, what? You can't come up with any original ideas, so now we're going to just make fun of
what we are.
What we are. Like that's what we're doing. And my co-host will argue with me. My co-host actually, my co-host Lane, she loves Scream, and we fought on this one. And I hate it. Like I really, really don't like it, because I view that as the point at which horror, not only did it kind of, laugh at itself, but it realized, the studios at least realized that, we don't have to come up with creative concepts for horror movies anymore. We can just kind of recycle the same stuff.
Yeah.
So, you get that, and then you get the Blair Witch Project, which comes out in '99, which honestly is a joke. Like I personally hate it. I hate that movie more than I hate Scream.
I honestly found it so irritating.
It's irritating because, like, I will tell you this: it has brilliant marketing. Like I think the people behind Blair Witch could teach a master class in marketing, and it would be worth every single penny, because in essence they took an idea that was literally the same as an idea of a 5-year-old with a video camera walking around their backyard and cutting something together and calling it a movie. That's in essence what they did, okay? And they put it together in a 90-minute movie and were able to sell it. It's like literally selling a turd sandwich. Like, you literally did that. I mean, there's no nutritional value to the turd sandwich. It's a turd sandwich. But you sold it. You convinced people that this is good, and it influenced horror for the next, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, with the whole found film trope.
Well, you've got that still. I mean, that's not nearly as much anymore.
Thankfully.
Thank God. But I view that as kind of, again, it's not necessarily the type of horror that it is. It is what it represents. It represents a devoid of creativity, because you even see it kind of come into, we're not going to create new ideas. We're just going to remake, Japanese horror films, like The Grudge and Ringu and all those. We're not going to try to do our own. We're going to remake that. We're going to remake, or you get the Saw stuff, which is, there's no really good characters, but it's just, torture porn.
Yeah.
And
or
that's Hostel. I mean, it's that idea.
Yeah, and that's, I think, kind of an issue that I have with a lot of the recent horror that's come out, and I mean recent by post 2000-ish, because I would consider that recent, is that the remakes and the remakes and the remakes. And I know we have covered remakes extensively on Beauties and Headcanons. We actually had a whole episode dedicated to it that I titled Remakes and the Unethical Marketing of Nostalgia. If anybody wants to...
We did one too. Just to say, I think it's episode 2 or 3. I can't repeat what the title is.
Yeah.
I almost consider making a T-shirt of it, but that's but that's in essence what it is.
But yeah, because I mean that is exactly what it is. It's, and we discussed this thoroughly in the episode, but just TLDR recap. Remakes in general, if they aren't adding anything or expounding upon something, or even in some cases fixing something that's potentially problematic in some cases, not necessarily in the horror genre, but in remakes in general, I think it can be okay. But unfortunately, in the vast majority of remakes, that is not the case. It's not any kind of derivative. There's nothing of substance added. It's just remade and marketed off of the nostalgia of, people will remember this, so they'll come back and see it, right? you know?
Well, I mean, and I think we discussed this on that episode. So my co-hosts are fantastic because they approach it from different points of view. And one of the points of view that my co-host John Woolscroft brought up was that nowadays it is extremely difficult. And this is getting pretty deep into film business, okay? It is extremely difficult nowadays to predict whether a movie is going to be a hit or not. So if you are a studio, let's say that you are Warner Brothers, okay? Let's say you're Warner Brothers, and you are funded by venture capitalists in Wall Street, because that is where most of the studios are getting their money from. They're not getting it from anyone in Hollywood, or they might be, but it's for the most part it's coming from venture capitalists in Wall Street, people, financial sector. And those people are not interested in storytelling. They're interested in making a profit. So, back in the old days, and I'm not talking too old, I'm talking maybe like the 80s or the 90s even, movies were sold either by the genre or they were sold by whoever the actor or actress was in it. Mm-hmm. You would say, oh, I'm going to go see that new Tom Cruise movie. I don't know why you would, but you would. Or I'm going to go see that new Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. I heard he's on Mars nowadays.
Yeah.
So, but seriously, look at the posters. And what is it? It's Arnold Schwarzenegger's face on Mars. You don't know anything about that movie, but you know that Total Recall has Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. And Arnold Schwarzenegger is one of the biggest action stars at the world at that time. So it was easier to say, well, if I put Arnold in my movie, if I, get that, it doesn't matter what the story is. I can get creative with the story, but as long as I got Arnold in it, I know that I'm going to have a return on my investment. Mm-hmm. Now, you get to nowadays, and that no longer is the case. Mm-hmm. Because I personally, I believe that the audience is somewhat smarter. Mm-hmm. There's also more competition nowadays. It used to be that your TV choices were sitcoms. Mm-hmm. And now you've got sitcoms, but you also have, in essence, what are, majorly long movies over the course of multiple seasons. Mm-hmm. So that people can binge, on demand.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily bank on either the genre or the actor being it. So what do you do instead? To hedge your bets, you rely on an established audience.
Exactly.
And that's where you get these movies.
As a writer and as somebody who is creative, it's so frustrating to see all these derivative works that aren't really worth the film that they're printed on. I look at some of these things that are coming out and I'm like, you know what? I write better stuff than this, and I write it for free. Like, it's hard not to get frustrated at something like that.
Well, I mean, here's the one thing I would say is that you look at, and I bring up Jordan Peele, and the reason I bring up Jordan Peele is because he is the X factor that doesn't follow that. A movie like Get Out and Us, where Us I liked a little less than Get Out. I thought Get Out was fantastic. Mm-hmm. Those movies buck the system in such a way that the audiences flock to them. Mm-hmm. Okay? You look at even his Twilight Zone stuff, which I watched, I think, one episode of it, and I liked it. I just haven't had a chance to watch the rest of it. And, again, it is bucking the trend of everything has to be a derivative. He's using the name Twilight Zone, but he's creating his own kind of works with it. That gives me a little bit of hope. Because it's original things that are sticking out. Mm-hmm. I look at the movies like, I don't know, what was the most recent one? The Nun. I think that was one that I saw, and some Conjuring stuff. And, honestly, I always say this, no one's going to remember those movies in 10 years' time.
Definitely not.
I mean, you'll remember the first one because it was original at the time. But ultimately, I don't know anyone who says, oh, yeah, you remember Saw 6?
Yeah.
No, I remember the first Saw.
Yeah.
And maybe the second Saw because it wasn't that good. But I don't remember Saw 6.
Yeah.
I don't remember Paranormal Activity, Ghost Dimension, or any of these other really dumb, knockoffs of Blair Witch. So that's the thing is they'll get their money for it, and I always rag on Blumhouse because I don't really care for them, although they are the ones behind Get Out and Us, so there is something to be said for that. But no one's going to remember Happy Death Day. No one's going to. It's it,
Yeah, and that is definitely like a thing that I really love that Jordan Peele is doing. That I think we really need, like in the horror genre, but also in like the general movie making field in general. Where we need this kind of breath of fresh air, and I hope that seeing Jordan Peele do all of these things and be successful at them as well encourages other filmmakers to step up and say, you know what, I want to do my own thing too.
And I think it will. I think the other thing too is that Jordan Peele is able to do that because he's Jordan Peele.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is something to be said for that as well. You know, I always tell my students, and I follow this too, that, you know, you make your movie for you, or you make it for the screenwriter, whoever wrote the story. That movie is made for you. You're the filmmaker. It's made for you. If audiences like it, they're going to like it because you put yourself into the film.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think part of the problem is that these movies that we're seeing, the ones that resonate are ones that have the filmmaker's, you know, heart and soul put into them. Mm-hmm. But if they're just done because some studio's like, oh yeah, you know what? Found footage movies are popular now. Let's crank out a found footage movie every year. Mm-hmm. Doesn't really matter what the story is. You know, throw some spooky stuff in there and you call it a day. You know, when you get some low rent director who just is putting them through for the sake of putting them through, mm-hmm. It's going to show, and the audiences aren't going to be attracted to it.
Yeah, definitely. You know, you can feel that energy coming off of it. Where, you know, if a director and actors and the screenwriters aren't into it, if they're just, you know, trying to get by and get paid for it, you know, versus if they're really invested and they're passionate and they feel for this particular project that they're working on. Yeah. I feel the same thing, you know, sometimes when I read fan fiction, I can tell when an author is not really necessarily feeling it, but for some reason is just cranking it out anyway. And I can also feel when they're really particularly passionate about this particular topic, about a particular trope, about particular characters. You can feel that difference through the screen.
Oh yeah, and I love the Marvel films. I know this is a nerd podcast too, so I think I can bring it up. I do love the Marvel films. I have problems with some of them.
Oh yeah,
but at the same time, when I'm watching a Marvel film, I can tell when the director loves what they're doing, even if it's a Marvel film. Mm-hmm. You know, I know that Anthony and Joe Russo loved working on Avengers. Mm-hmm. Infinity War and Endgame. I can tell, you know, but at the same time, if I go back to, I don't know, Thor the Dark World, and I watch that, and I'm like,
yeah, maybe not so much.
I don't think not so much. Yeah.
There's a big difference between something like Black Panther and Iron Man 3. Going to transition just really quick to our gaming corner.
Sure.
So if any of you saw my post from earlier this week, you know that I have been playing around in Fallout 3, kind of revisiting a lot of quests and a lot of areas that I just didn't get a chance to before. And of course, you know, there are a couple of kind of like creepy and kind of horror-inspired places to go to. My initial post was about the Mind Quest in Point Lookout, but one of probably the more infamous locations in Fallout 3 is Vault 108, also affectionately known as the Gary Vault. So if anybody knows anything about Fallout, you'll know that Vault Tech, when they made these vaults, the vast majority of them were not to house people in the event of a nuclear apocalypse. There were a couple that were, you know, legitimately for that purpose and were used for that purpose, but the vast majority of them were used to perform highly unethical experiments. And
yeah, it's bad time, man.
Yes. Yes.
You're gonna have a bad time.
Definitely a bad time. So in Vault 108, they set up a huge string of really messed up situations. The particular overseer that they put into place had an incurable form of cancer that was going to kill him in about 40 months from the time that they went under. They had no other people in power of positions. They had the resources of the vault set to malfunction early before the vault was supposed to be unlocked. They had insufficient resources of food and water and no entertainment to speak of except for a huge cache of weapons because, you know, why not? And one of the things that they were doing in that vault was cloning. And they were cloning a very specific person named Gary. And unfortunately, with each time that they cloned him, Gary became more and more hostile towards the non-Garys. And so they had to kind of like segregate them so that they
that's the multiplicity rule.
Yes. So that
you're familiar with the movie Multiplicity. Yeah, you can't make a copy of a copy.
Mm-hmm. And so they kind of like cordoned them off, and they started running out of space, and they're like, okay, well, we're gonna have to, I don't know, kill them off now. And the little holotapes kind of cut off there. So when you get to the vault, there is nobody but Gary clones. So I mean, you can kind of imagine that nobody else survived aside from the Gary clones. But the interesting thing about the Gary clones is they don't actually say anything but Gary. So especially if you're like me and you go in there sneaking around, you'll all of a sudden see her like Gary going on in the background. It's like, oh my god, where's that coming from? And you're like, hitting your vet so you can try to like target them, like where are they coming from? And you'll just hear like Gary. And honestly, like by this point I had played way creepier quests, so I wasn't as creeped out as I probably could have been. It was more of just like a laugh, but it kind of reminded me of just this interesting concept of a potential 80s horror movie or maybe in a 50s horror movie where nuclear apocalypse and clones and
that just sounds
running
like
all over the place.
A horror comedy.
Yes, like a horror
really
comedy.
Sounds like a horror comedy.
Kind of like a Return of the Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah. I mean, that's that realm.
Yeah, which I mean, definitely I think has its place. Movies like Evil Dead 2.
Return of the Living Dead. Oh no, Evil Dead 2 is amazing.
Oh yes.
Oh, it's
yes.
amazing. I have a friend of mine who is a filmmaker in Pittsburgh, and his name's Steve Rosinski, and the man has a talent for combining horror with comedy. Mm-hmm. Because I think honestly, comedy is one of the hardest genres to master, mm-hmm. because everyone is, comedy is subjective. What I find funny might not be the same thing as what you find funny, mm-hmm. So if you're able to master comedy and then you decide, oh yeah, you know what, I want to drop it smack dab in the middle of a horror movie, that's a skill. That's a skill, and it definitely does its place.
Oh yeah, it's very, very hard to do. It's a very fine line to walk between keeping it a horror movie but also incorporating the comedy in a way that will be meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are movies that do it well, and there are movies that don't do it so well.
Yeah, there are some that are kind of like, this needs to go off now. Horror and honestly any sort of entertainment is really flourishing not on film nowadays. It's not. And it's sad to hear that, but it's the truth. You look at TV shows like, I don't really watch The Walking Dead, but it's basically Night of Living Dead. It's basically Night of Living Dead. Like that's in essence what that series is. Yeah,
I stopped watching a long time ago. It's just like boring.
It's Night of Living Dead.
Yeah, it's basically all it is.
Yeah, but I watched this series over the summer called Nosferatu on AMC, and I think it was AMC, and that was a fantastic horror drama that was a TV series, and then. I'm really finding some good stuff. I was watching the Creep Show series that's on Shudder. That's really good. That's where it's at. It's also, honestly, it's with indie filmmakers. I would tell your audience, if you don't like the direction that horror movies are going, don't give them money.
Yeah.
Don't see them. Mm-hmm. If you don't like remakes, don't give them money. If you... And this is just coming from a personal perspective here. It is hard as an independent filmmaker to convince somebody who doesn't know you, who is only familiar with what they get on Netflix or what they get on Amazon Prime, to put their money down on your film that hasn't been tested. Mm-hmm. That is just, I made this with my own blood, sweat, and tears. Mm-hmm. So I would tell your audience, when you go to a horror film convention and you see that indie filmmaker that's sitting at the table and he's, either drunk or, nervous, buy their movie. Just buy it. And honestly, whether it's good or not, just buy the movie. And, because here's the thing. You are not only supporting that person's dream, you are supporting an independent voice in the genre, and that's really what you want, because that person could be the next Jordan Peele, could be the next Wes Craven, could be the next Clive Barker. And your support helps them learn as a filmmaker and grow as a filmmaker. We talked about Evil Dead 2. Did you ever see Sam Raimi's first film called Within the Woods?
No, I didn't.
Look it up. I think there's a bootleg VHS copy on YouTube that someone transferred over. It is literally the exact same thing as a film student would make. And it sets the ground rules of a lot of what makes up the Evil Dead. So he made Within the Woods with Bruce Campbell, with a couple other actors, and he changed some certain things around. This was kind of like his first version. But getting that publicity allowed him to reach out investors to make Evil Dead, which then just blew his career up from there.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the thing I would leave you with about horror films is just, your audience should invest in indie filmmakers. Give them your money, give them your support. Don't give it to the next Paranormal Activity or Conjuring movie, because I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to be disappointed and you're going to be upset that you wasted $9-10 on something that is really garbage.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, we definitely strive to support indie artists as much as possible. I know when Lindsay ever goes to cons, she's always, looking at all the artist styles and, buying things from them. Every other Friday that we don't have an episode, I've started doing a fan art Friday where I can feature different artists with their permission, of course, and, just show off, different artists within our community and maybe get them some more traffic, maybe get them some commissions, even just get them more exposure. Yeah. As much as possible. I want to support something like that because it's clear that, the big companies are not going to be where the true art is at. You're going to find the true art in the smaller spaces, in the independent spaces where, big money is not going to have an influence on the direction of the story or how it's told or anything like that. And it's just going to be the passion of the filmmaker, the scriptwriter, and the actors and whoever else is involved.
And I mean, you look at Amazon Prime, for instance. Okay, Amazon Prime was built on the backs of indie filmmakers. Okay, before it blew up with Miss Maisel, which I love that series. It's a great series. And a lot of their premium content they have now, where they have ties with Hollywood studios. Before that platform was built with the blood, sweat, and tears of indie filmmakers. And as a thank you to the indie filmmakers, once they blew up, once they blew up, Amazon decided to cut the royalties that they pay to independent filmmakers by ridiculous proportions.
Yep.
That right there says volumes about how these companies treat independent artists. I have friends that are filmmakers that they're like, yeah, I'm not putting my stuff on Prime anymore. And it's like, well, why? It's like, because I'm not making any money from it. I can't make a dime from it because of that. It's like, yeah, I can put up there and maybe I'll get something. But, that's the world we're living in, is that, the streaming wars, as they're so much called, they're not really counting on the indie filmmaker. They're counting on, how do we get, these people that traditionally would go to the theaters and do big runs like that, how do we get them in our pool and not really give two craps about the indie filmmaker?
Yeah, this whole streaming thing is such an interesting dichotomy because there's so much room for good and bad. Like there is. Like there is the room to be a little bit more creative, do things that are a little bit different with, I guess, a little bit less risk. But at the same time, you also risk being run over with the same exact thing that Hollywood is being run over with right now. So it's a double-edged sword, definitely, where you have to just be careful and really consider what is going to be worth your time and money and investment.
I mean, ultimately, what I would tell the filmmaker is that you cannot put all your eggs in one basket anymore.
Definitely.
You cannot count on, I'm going to just get that distribution deal and then everything will be good. You can't rely on that anymore. You just can't. Can't even rely on festivals anymore.
Yeah.
You honestly have to diversify and ask yourself very honestly, where is my audience located at? Where are they at? Are they on YouTube? If they are on YouTube, put your movie on YouTube. You know, what are your ends? Are your ends that you want to grow your brand? Do you want to make money off of your film? You know, that's what you want to ask yourself. If you made a short film, I would tell you, put it on YouTube. Truth be told, you're not going to make money off of a short film anymore. It's just not possible. Do a little bit of a festival run if you get in, you know, put a couple submissions out there, but don't do it. I mean, my short film that I made recently called The Autumn People, I did it for a burlesque and sideshow group in town as their opening film for their festival last year. For the first time, I tried to put it into film festivals. I haven't heard back. But I then reached out to a friend of mine who was running BloodyDisgusting.com, who was running their World of Death. His name's Tony Wash. He's a fantastic filmmaker. And, you know, I said, hey, you know, I have this movie. It's done. Do you think it'd be a good fit for your YouTube channel? You know? And I got over, because he put it came out, I think, in September. And I hit, just with that one video, 1,400 views.
Wow.
In just that month. So that's 1,400 eyeballs looking at my short film. Take that into consideration.
Yeah, which, I mean, you wouldn't have got that at a film festival. You wouldn't have got that anywhere else.
No, you wouldn't have. I mean, if you got into Sundance, yeah, you would have.
Yeah, but I mean, you're not going to get into Sundance.
You're not going to get into Sundance. It's not happening. You're not Kevin Smith. It doesn't work that way.
No. Yeah, Sundance is more for Hollywood now. It's not about the whole indie films anymore, unfortunately.
They pick maybe one or two indie films just so they can brag and you know, sniff their own farts.
Yes. That's pretty much it. So that is about all we have time for.
Cool.
What did you guys think? Do you guys watch horror movies? What is your favorite one? Contact us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or Tumblr, and share your thoughts about this episode and your guys' favorite horror films. I'm Elizabeth, and thanks for listening to Beauties and Headcanons.
All right, thank you.